Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bleak Fears. Tonight, we bring you 9 chilling, true Appalachian Trail horror stories that will change how you view every mountain hike you have ever considered. These are not fictional tales, but real experiences from hikers who faced something horrifying along America's longest footpath. Each account comes directly from survivors who endured these traumatic events and chose to share their stories so others might recognize the warning signs. The wilderness paths we believe will bring us closer to nature can conceal threats we never imagine. From human evil lurking in isolated shelters to occurrences that challenge everything we understand about reality. If you enjoy authentic horror stories based on actual events, subscribe to Bleak Fears and turn on notifications so you stay updated with our explorations of the darkest true encounters. Once you've listened to these unsettling accounts, leave your own strange hiking stories in the comments section. We're creating a space where outdoor enthusiasts can alert each other about the hidden perils waiting off the beaten path. Now brace yourself as we explore 9 incidents that turned peaceful treks into absolute nightmares. Eliel had been on the Appalachian Trail for 11 days when he reached Blood Mountain in early June of 2003. At 28, this was his first attempt at a through hike, and the Georgia section had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As a high school biology teacher from Ohio, he thought he understood the natural world well enough. The mountain was proving him wrong. The afternoon heat was oppressive, unseasonably warm for early summer in the southern Appalachians. Eliel's shirt clung to his back, soaked through with sweat as he climbed the rocky approach to Blood Mountain Shelter. He'd been looking forward to reaching it since morning. The shelter sat at over 4,000 feet elevation, and he hoped the altitude might bring cooler air. When he arrived at the 3-sided stone structure around 4 in the afternoon, he found it completely empty. This surprised him. Blood Mountain Shelter was famous among hikers, one of the few stone shelters on the entire trail. Most days it filled up quickly, especially during through hiking season, but the shelter stood silent, almost deliberately vacant. Eliel dropped his pack on the wooden sleeping platform and immediately felt uneasy. He couldn't identify why. The shelter appeared normal enough. Stone walls on 3 sides, open front facing the trail, wooden sleeping platform elevated about 2 feet off the ground. But something felt wrong in a way his rational mind couldn't process. The wood beneath his hands felt strange. Not wet exactly, but almost clammy. He pulled his hand back and examined his palm. Nothing there. No moisture, no residue. Just that odd sensation that lingered on his skin like he'd touched something that had been touching him back. He set up his sleeping bag and filtered water from a nearby spring. 2 other hikers passed by before sunset, both choosing to push on to the next shelter despite the late hour. One of them, an older man with a gray beard, glanced at the Blood Mountain Shelter and shook his head. "You staying here tonight?" he asked Eliel. "Planning on it. Why?" The man paused, seemed to consider saying something, then just shrugged. "No reason. Just never liked this one much. Safe hiking." Eliel watched him disappear down the trail and felt his unease deepen. But the next shelter was 6 miles away, and dusk was already settling into the hollows. He'd stay. He'd be fine. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Eliel ate a cold dinner, not wanting to bother with his stove. The shelter faced west, and he watched the last light fade from the sky between the mountains. That's when he first noticed the walls seemed to be sweating. At first he thought it was condensation, moisture from the cooling air meeting the stone. But the walls were stone on the outside only. The interior was wooden planking, old and dark with age. And the moisture was appearing on the wood, not the stone. Tiny beads forming along the grain, catching the light from his headlamp. Eliel reached out and touched the wall again. The wood felt warm. Not sun warm, but body warm. Like something alive. He jerked his hand back and laughed at himself, a nervous sound that echoed strangely in the empty shelter. just wood reacting to temperature change. He was tired. His mind was playing tricks. He climbed into his sleeping bag around 8:30, exhausted from the day's climb. Sleep came quickly despite his unease. He woke in absolute darkness to a sensation he couldn't immediately identify, something rhythmic, a gentle pulsing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Eliel lay perfectly still, trying to understand what he was feeling. The sleeping platform beneath him was moving, not shaking like an earthquake, but rising and falling slowly, consistently, like breathing. His hand fumbled for his headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, and he immediately wished he'd stayed in the dark. The wooden walls were no longer just sweating. They were glistening, covered in a thin film that caught the light with an oily sheen. And they were moving, expanding slightly, then contracting, in perfect rhythm with the pulsing he felt beneath him. The shelter was breathing. Eliel's rational mind tried to find an explanation: settling wood, temperature fluctuation, anything. But the movement was too regular, too organic. He could see the walls expand as if inhaling, hold for a moment, then contract as if exhaling, over and over, a breath every 6 seconds. He needed to get out, now. Eliel tried to sit up and immediately realized something was terribly wrong. His sleeping bag wouldn't move properly. The bottom portion felt stuck to the wooden platform. He pulled harder and heard a sound that made his stomach turn. A wet, tearing sound, like pulling tape off skin. He aimed his headlamp down at his sleeping bag. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. The fabric at the bottom of his bag had partially fused with the wood beneath it. Not just stuck to it. Fused. The synthetic material seemed to have merged with the wooden planks, the two materials blending together in a way that shouldn't be possible. Thin, root-like structures had grown from the wood into the fabric. They looked almost like the mycelium of mushrooms, but darker, more fibrous. And as he watched in horror, one of them moved slightly, growing, reaching. Eliel yanked his legs up toward his chest, pulling his feet away from the fused section. His sleeping bag ripped, leaving the bottom portion still attached to the platform. He scrambled backward until his back hit the breathing wall. The moment his bare skin touched the wood, he felt them. Tiny prickling sensations, dozens of them, like invisible needles pushing into the exposed skin of his shoulder blade where his shirt had ridden up. He launched himself forward with a scream, stumbling off the platform onto the dirt floor of the shelter. His hand scraped against the ground as he caught himself. When he looked back at the wall where he'd made contact, he could see his skin oils marking the spot. And within those marks, tiny white filaments were emerging from the wood grain, reaching toward where his skin had been, searching. This wasn't condensation. This wasn't his imagination. The shelter itself was alive, and it was trying to consume him. Eliel's hands shook as he grabbed his pack. His sleeping bag was a loss. He could see more of those root-like structures spreading through it now, breaking it down, absorbing it into the wood. In the beam of his headlamp, the entire shelter seemed to pulse with life. The walls expanded and contracted. The platform rose and fell. Even the roof beams seemed to bend slightly with each breath. He had to check himself, had to know if any of those filaments had gotten into his skin. With trembling hands, Eliel pulled off his shirt and twisted to examine his shoulder blade in the light. At first he saw nothing, just the normal expanse of his back, sweaty from fear. Then he noticed them, tiny white lines just beneath the surface of his skin, like extremely thin roots visible through translucent soil. They branched out from several points where the wood had touched him, spreading slowly under his epidermis. The panic that seized him was primal. Eliel grabbed his pocket knife, and without thinking about sterility or safety, began picking at his skin where the filaments had entered. The pain was sharp, but he didn't care. He had to get them out. He had to get them out now. Blood ran down his back as he dug at the entry points. The filaments were shallow, not deeply rooted yet. He managed to extract several, pulling them out like splinters. They were stronger than they looked, not breaking easily. When he finally pulled one free completely, he held it in his palm under the light. It writhed slightly, still alive, still searching for something to anchor to. He threw it away in revulsion and continued working on his back, twisting painfully to reach the spots he couldn't easily see. Some of the filaments had already spread too far under his skin. He could see them branching, but couldn't reach the tips. Those would have to stay, at least for now. When he'd done all he could, Eliel grabbed his pack and stumbled out of the shelter into the night. He didn't care that it was pitch dark. He didn't care that hiking at night on rocky mountain trails was dangerous. He had to get away from that breathing structure. He looked back once from the trail. The shelter sat in the darkness like a patient predator. And now that he knew to look for it, he could see the movement even from outside. The entire structure expanding and contracting slowly. Breathing. Alive. Eliel hiked through the night, driven by fear and adrenaline. Every few miles he stopped to examine his back, picking at the spots where filaments remained under his skin. By the time dawn broke, he'd made it nearly 8 miles from Blood Mountain. His back was a mess of scratches and small wounds, but he was alive. He was away. 3 days later, in the town of Hiawassee, Eliel found a clinic. The doctor examined his back with confusion, calling in a colleague to look at the strange marks beneath his skin. The filaments were still visible, though they'd stopped growing. They looked almost like very thin scar tissue now, hardened and inactive. The doctors had no explanation. They'd never seen anything like it. One suggested they might be some kind of parasitic plant material, but that was just a guess. They cleaned his wounds, gave him antibiotics, and advised him to see a specialist when he got home. Eliel never continued his through hike. He went home to Ohio that same week. Back home, he couldn't let it go. As a biology teacher, he needed to understand what had happened. He contacted a mycologist at Ohio State University, a professor who specialized in fungal biology. When Eliel described the shelter and his experience, the professor's interest was immediate. They exchanged emails for weeks. The professor explained that the Appalachian Mountains, particularly the older sections, housed some of the most extensive fungal networks on Earth. Some of these networks were ancient, possibly thousands of years old. Most were benign, essential parts of the forest ecosystem. But there were documented cases of parasitic species that could interact with organic materials in unexpected ways. The professor theorized that Blood Mountain Shelter might have been built directly over a massive fungal colony. Over the 20-plus years since its construction, the fungus could have infiltrated the wooden components of the structure. Given the right conditions, certain aggressive species could attempt to break down and absorb any organic material that came into contact with them, including human tissue. The explanation was scientific, rational, grounded in biological possibility. Somehow that made it worse. This wasn't supernatural. It was nature, but nature behaving in a way that saw Eliel as nothing more than nutrients to be absorbed. 5 years have passed since that night in June 2003. Eliel still has the scars on his back, but worse than the scars are the filaments that remain under his skin. They never completely disappeared. In his bathroom mirror, if the light is right, he can still see them. Thin white lines branching under his shoulder blade. And sometimes, particularly on warm, humid nights, he swears he can feel them. A faint prickling sensation, like they're trying to grow again, reaching for something, searching for the wood they came from. Eliel never went back to the Appalachian Trail. He never even goes camping anymore. And he's developed an aversion to wooden furniture that his friends find odd but he can't explain. Because he knows something now that he wishes he didn't. Sometimes the shelter is not shelter at all. Sometimes it's the thing you need shelter from. And by the time you realize the difference, it might already be inside you, growing, waiting, part of you forever. Jordan had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 6 days when the fog rolled in near Klingman's Dome in late September 2019. At 42, she considered herself an experienced hiker. She'd completed 3 successful section hikes over the past decade, always alone, always with her camera. Photography was her profession, but more than that, it was how she processed the world. Through a lens, everything made sense. The fog came quickly that afternoon, typical for the Smoky Mountains in early fall. One moment she could see the ridgeline ahead. The next she was walking through a gray void so thick she could barely see 10 feet in front of her. Jordan slowed her pace, relying on the white blazes painted on trees to keep her on trail. She'd hiked in fog before. It was disorienting but manageable. That's when she saw the first one. A man was walking toward her on the trail, moving in her direction. Nothing unusual about that. Hikers passed each other constantly, but something about his movement caught her attention in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. He was walking backward, not stumbling or looking over his shoulder, but moving in reverse as naturally as if he were walking forward. His feet stepped backward, his body faced away from his direction of travel, yet he moved toward her with complete confidence. Jordan stopped and stared. The man drew closer, still moving in that impossible backward walk. When he was about 15 feet away, he turned his head to look at her. He smiled. A friendly, casual smile, like they were passing on a sunny afternoon instead of in dense fog while he defied basic physics. Then he continued past her, still walking backward, but somehow moving forward down the trail behind her. She stood frozen for a full minute after he disappeared into the fog. Her brain tried to process what she'd seen. Maybe he had been walking backward intentionally, some kind of exercise hikers did. That was possible. Unusual, but possible. Except his movement had been too smooth, too natural, and he'd been covering ground quickly, faster than someone carefully stepping in. Reverse should be able to move. Jordan pulled out her camera, a professional digital model she'd carried on every hike. If she saw anyone else, she wanted documentation, proof of what she was seeing, or proof that her mind was playing tricks in the disorienting fog. She continued hiking. 20 minutes later, she encountered a couple. They were walking side by side on the narrow trail, which should have been difficult. But like the first man, they were both moving backward, facing away from their direction of travel, walking in reverse, yet moving toward and then past her with the ease of people on an evening stroll. The woman met Jordan's eyes as they passed and gave a small wave. Her expression showed no awareness that anything was unusual. Jordan raised her camera and took 3 quick shots as they moved past her. The shutter clicked in the muffled silence of the fog. Neither of them reacted to being photographed. She watched them disappear into the gray behind her, both still moving in that wrong backward walk. Her hands shook as she checked the photos on her camera's display screen. The images were slightly blurred, as if the couple had been moving quickly, but they were there. 2 people on a trail in fog. She zoomed in on the image. They appeared to be walking normally in the photo, facing forward, standard hiking posture. But she knew what she'd seen. They'd been facing the opposite direction. Over the next 2 hours, Jordan encountered 7 more people, all of them moving the same impossible way. An older woman with a bright blue backpack. A young man with a dog on a leash. The dog also somehow trotting backward. 2 teenage girls hiking together. A middle-aged man in expensive hiking gear. A couple in their 30s holding hands. Each one walking backward, yet moving forward. Each one passing her with casual normalcy, sometimes offering friendly greetings, completely unaware that they were defying the basic rules of motion. She photographed them all. Her camera's memory card filled with images of hikers in fog, and in every photo, they appeared normal. Walking forward, standard posture, nothing unusual. But Jordan knew the truth. She'd seen them. She'd watched their backward movement with her own eyes. The fog began to lift as she approached the observation tower at Klingman's Dome. The gray thinned, revealing patches of sky and distant mountains. Jordan climbed to the tower's circular ramp, spiraling up to the observation deck. From the top, she could see for miles as the fog continued to dissipate in the valleys below. What she saw made her grip the railing so hard, her knuckles went white. In the clearings and along the visible sections of trail below, there were people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and every single one was moving backward. She could see them clearly now in the improving visibility. Hikers, tourists, families with children, all walking in reverse, yet somehow progressing forward through space. The entire mountain was covered with people defying physics, and none of them seemed to notice. Jordan watched for nearly 20 minutes, unable to look away from the impossible scene. A family of 4 walked backward past a trail sign. A solo hiker consulted a map while walking backward up a steep section. 2 women took a selfie, both facing away from their direction of travel, but holding the phone behind them as if it were in front. Then, as suddenly as the fog had lifted, everything changed. Jordan blinked, and when she opened her eyes, everyone was walking normally. Forward, standard human motion. She scanned the valleys desperately, looking for anyone still moving backward. Nothing. Just regular hikers on a regular autumn day in the Smokies. She descended from the tower quickly, almost running down the circular ramp. At the bottom, she approached a couple resting on a bench. They looked familiar. The same couple she'd photographed an hour ago, moving backward through the fog. Jordan tried to keep her voice steady. "Excuse me, did you 2 hike up through the fog earlier?" The man nodded. "Yeah, pretty thick down lower. Glad it cleared." "Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone walking strangely?" They looked at each other, confused. The woman shook her head. "No. Why? Did something happen?" "The fog can mess with your head," the man offered. "Makes everything seem weird. We saw you up on the tower just now. You okay?" They'd seen her. They'd been down in the valley moving backward, and they'd seen her standing on the tower. How was that possible if they'd been facing the wrong direction? Jordan made an excuse and walked away. She found a quiet spot off the main trail and went through every photo on her camera. Over 40 images from the past few hours. Hikers in fog, people on trails. All of them appearing completely normal in the photographs. Walking forward, proper orientation, nothing unusual whatsoever. Except for one detail she hadn't noticed before. She zoomed in on a photo of the first man she'd encountered, the one who'd smiled at her while walking backward. The image showed him walking forward normally, but the ground beneath his feet told a different story. His boot prints in the mud were pointing the wrong direction. He was walking forward in the photo, but his footprints showed backward motion. She checked the other photos. Same thing. Every single image showed normal forward-walking hikers with backward-pointing footprints, the prints in mud, on dusty sections of trail, in patches of remaining snow at higher elevations. All of them reversed. Her breath came fast and shallow. The photos were evidence, but evidence of what? That she'd witnessed something impossible. That reality had bent somehow in the fog, or that her own perception couldn't be trusted. Jordan hiked down from Klingman's Dome that evening in a daze. She camped at a shelter 5 miles away and barely slept. The next morning, she broke her usual solo hiking rule and invited another hiker to walk with her for the day. A woman named Milani, who was attempting a southbound through hike. Jordan didn't tell her what had happened. She just wanted company, a witness, someone else to confirm that the world was working properly. They hiked together for 8 miles. Everything was normal. People walked forward. Physics behaved. The sun moved across the sky in the expected direction. By the time they parted ways that afternoon, Jordan had almost convinced herself the fog had caused some kind of temporary hallucination. 3 weeks later, she was home in Pennsylvania. She'd left the trail early, unable to shake the memory of what she'd seen. Her photographs from that day sat on her computer, opened and examined dozens of times. The backward footprints were clear in every image, undeniable, real. She considered posting the photos online. sharing her experience on hiking forums. But what would she say? That everyone had been walking backward except they hadn't. That the photos proved it except they didn't. She sounded insane even to herself. Instead, she contacted the Park Service. She asked if there had been any other unusual reports from Clingman's Dome on September 19th. The ranger she spoke with was polite but firm. No unusual incidents reported. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just a normal foggy day in the Smokies. Jordan asked about historical reports. Anything similar ever happening in that area? The ranger's tone changed slightly, became more careful. She said that fog in the mountains could cause optical illusions, disorientation. It happened occasionally. Hikers sometimes reported strange things. The human brain wasn't designed to process that level of sensory deprivation. It filled in gaps, created explanations, sometimes invented entire experiences that never happened. But the photographs didn't lie. The footprints were real. 5 years have passed since that foggy September day. Jordan still hikes, but never alone anymore. She carries her camera but rarely uses it. And she's never returned to the Smoky Mountains section of the Appalachian Trail. Sometimes late at night she opens those photographs again. She studies the backward footprints, traces them with her cursor on the screen. She's tried to research the phenomenon, looking for any physics that might explain what she witnessed. Quantum mechanics, temporal anomalies, spatial distortions, nothing fits. The only conclusion she can reach is one that frightens her more than any supernatural explanation could. Either reality broke that day on Clingman's Dome, or it was always broken, and she was just the only one who noticed. Either possibility means the world doesn't work the way we assume it does. Means that motion and direction and the flow of space itself might be more flexible than our minds can accept. She thinks about the people she saw, wonders if they're still out there, moving backward through a world that insists they're walking forward. Wonders if she sees them sometimes in her daily life, on city streets or in shopping centers, and simply doesn't notice anymore because her brain has learned to correct the impossible back into the possible. The Appalachian Trail is 2,000 miles of wilderness where anything could happen and no one would know, where the rules might be different, where up might be down and forward might be backward, and time itself might flow in directions we don't have words for. Jordan knows one thing for certain. She saw what she saw. The photographs prove it, even as they deny it. And somewhere in the Smoky Mountains, in the fog that rolls through ancient valleys, people are still walking the wrong way through space, moving backward into forward, defying everything we know about motion, and none of them realize it. None of them ever will. Have you ever witnessed something that your camera recorded differently than what you saw with your own eyes? What do you think those backward footprints really mean? Ozzy had been conducting geological surveys near Pearisburg, Virginia for 3 weeks when he found the cave in April 2015. At 35, he'd spent most of his adult life studying rock formations and mineral deposits across Appalachian regions. His work often took him to remote areas adjacent to the trail, places where few hikers ventured. He preferred it that way. Solitude let him focus on his research without distraction. The cave entrance wasn't marked on any of his geological maps. He discovered it while examining an abandoned mining operation from the early 1900s. The old shaft had collapsed decades ago, but recent rainfall had exposed a secondary opening about 40 yards from the original site. Fresh soil and disturbed vegetation suggested something had been digging there. Something large. Ozzy crouched near the entrance, examining the excavation. The dirt had been pushed outward from inside the cave, not scraped inward like an animal making a den. Whatever had done this was leaving, not entering. He photographed the disturbance with his field camera, noting the measurements in his survey log. Then he saw the tracks. 3 toes. Each print was roughly 14 inches long and 8 inches wide at the broadest point. The depth of the impressions suggested significant weight. perhaps 300 pounds or more. The stride length between prints measured nearly 6 feet. Ozzy had studied animal tracks extensively during his graduate work. These matched nothing in his reference materials. He followed the trail of prints away from the cave. They led into dense forest, moving uphill toward a rocky outcropping. The tracks were fresh, made within the past day based on the sharpness of the edges. Whatever left them had been here recently. A sound stopped him. It came from the direction of the cave behind him. Not quite a vocalization, more like air being forced through an instrument. A mechanical quality underneath something organic. The sound held multiple frequencies at once, creating an effect that made his chest vibrate uncomfortably. Then it resolved into something recognizable. A scream, but not human. The pitch was too high in some registers, too low in others. His analytical mind tried to process the acoustic properties, even as his body tensed with instinctive alarm. The sound contained harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a single source. It was as if 3 different creatures were screaming in perfect synchronization. Ozzy turned back toward the cave. He needed to see what was making that sound. Scientific curiosity overrode his growing unease. He'd encountered bears, mountain lions, even aggressive wild boar during fieldwork. Understanding the source of a threat was always better than running from unknown danger. The entrance gaped dark against the hillside. He pulled his high-powered flashlight from his pack and approached slowly. The scream came again, closer now, definitely originating from inside the cave. He could hear movement, something large shifting in the darkness beyond his light's reach. Then it emerged, partially, just enough for Ozzy to see. The limb that extended into the daylight was wrong in ways his brain struggled to categorize. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched over elongated bones. No hair, no scales, just smooth flesh that looked almost human but proportioned incorrectly. The arm, if it could be called that, was easily 7 feet long. It ended in a hand with 3 fingers, each tipped with a dark curved claw. The appendage reached out, almost exploratory, feeling along the cave entrance. Ozzy stood frozen, his scientific training warring with primal terror. He should run. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But he couldn't stop observing, categorizing, trying to understand what he was seeing. Another limb emerged on the opposite side of the entrance, then a third from above. The thing was pulling itself forward, using the cave opening for leverage. Ozzy caught a glimpse of the main body, vaguely humanoid in shape but stretched vertically, easily 9 feet tall even in a crouched position. No visible eyes, just smooth flesh where a face should be. The mouth was a vertical slit that opened as it produced another one of those impossible screams. The sound hit Ozzy like a physical force. His flashlight fell from his hand as he staggered backward. The frequency seemed designed to incapacitate, to trigger every fear response the human nervous system possessed. His legs finally obeyed the command to move. He ran. Behind him, he heard the thing exit the cave fully, heard the irregular rhythm of its movement through the underbrush. It was following him, not quickly but deliberately. The sounds it made as it moved suggested it wasn't built for speed, but it was persistent. Ozzy crashed through laurel thickets, branches tearing at his clothes and exposed skin. His geological survey pack bounced against his back, 20 pounds of equipment he couldn't spare time to shed. He could hear the creature behind him, maintaining distance, but never falling back. Every few minutes it would scream again, that awful multi-frequency sound that made his bones ache. He'd parked his vehicle 3 miles from the cave site. 3 miles of rough terrain with no marked trail. His GPS unit bounced against his chest as he ran, but he didn't dare slow down to check it. He knew the general direction. That had to be enough. The forest seemed to conspire against him. Roots grabbed at his boots. Low branches appeared at face height. The ground shifted from solid to muddy without warning. Behind him, the creature adapted to each obstacle with unsettling ease. He could hear it climbing when the terrain grew steep, its long limbs finding purchase on surfaces he had to scramble across. 20 minutes into his flight, Ozzy burst onto the Appalachian Trail itself. The marked path cut through the forest like a lifeline. He turned north, toward where he knew there would be other hikers. The creature had been pursuing him through isolated wilderness. Maybe the presence of other people would make it retreat. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for rest, but the sound of pursuit never diminished. If anything, reaching the open trails seemed to make the thing bolder. He could hear it crashing through the underbrush parallel to the path, keeping pace but staying just out of sight. Then he saw them. 2 hikers coming south on the trail, young men with full packs marking them as through hikers. Ozzy's relief was overwhelming. He wasn't alone anymore. The hikers saw him running and stopped, concern evident on their faces. As Ozzy reached them, gasping for breath, the sounds of pursuit abruptly ceased. The forest behind him fell silent, except for normal bird song and wind through leaves. "Are you okay?" one of the hikers asked. "What happened?" Ozzy bent over, hands on his knees, trying to form words between ragged breaths. "Something was chasing me, in the woods. You need to see it." The hikers exchanged glances. "Like a bear?" "No, not a bear. Something else. It was following me for miles." They listened, as Ozzy explained, their expressions shifting from concern to skepticism. When he described what he'd seen at the cave, one of them suggested heat exhaustion. The other offered water. Neither seemed inclined to believe that anything unusual had been chasing him. "We've been hiking through here for hours," the first one said. "Haven't seen anything weird. Lots of wildlife, but nothing dangerous." Ozzy wanted to argue, to make them understand, but looking at their faces, he realized how his story sounded. A man running from something he could barely describe, claiming it had chased him for 3 miles through terrain where neither had seen or heard anything unusual. He thanked them for the water and continued toward his vehicle, this time walking. The hikers headed south, occasionally glancing back at him, with expressions mixing concern and doubt. Ozzy kept watching the tree line as he walked, but nothing emerged. Whatever had pursued him had vanished the moment he reached other people. His truck sat where he'd left it at the trailhead parking area. Ozzy got in, locked the doors, and sat shaking for 10 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. His hands were scratched and bleeding from his flight through the underbrush. His clothes were torn, but he was alive. The next day, Ozzy returned with 2 wildlife officials from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. He brought them to the cave, showed them the excavation, pointed out where the tracks should be. Rain had fallen overnight. The prints were still visible, softened but identifiable. The officials made plaster casts of the best preserved tracks. They photographed the cave entrance and the disturbed soil. "Could be bear," one official suggested, though his tone carried uncertainty. "Sometimes their tracks can look strange in mud." 3 toes, Ozzy countered. "Bears have 5. They had no answer for that. The official took samples of shed skin they found near the cave entrance, sent them to a lab for analysis. Weeks later, the results came back inconclusive. Organic material, possibly mammalian but contaminated and degraded. Nothing could be definitively determined. Ozzy had recorded audio during part of his flight. His phone had been in his shirt pocket, set to record field notes. When he played back the file, the creature's screams were clearly audible. He sent the recording to a professor he knew who specialized in bioacoustics. The analysis took a month. When the report came back, it raised more questions than answers. The vocalizations contained infrasound frequencies below the range of normal human hearing. These frequencies were known to induce feelings of fear and unease in mammals. Some large predators used infrasound to disorient prey before attacking. But the professor noted something unusual. The sound appeared to come from multiple sources producing different frequencies simultaneously. No known animal could do that with a single vocal structure. "If this is real," the professor wrote in his email, "it represents something previously undocumented. The acoustic properties don't match any creature in our database. I'd need more samples to draw conclusions, but this recording alone is remarkable. Ozzy never found more samples. He returned to the cave 3 more times over the following months. Each time, it was empty. The tracks had been washed away by subsequent rains. No evidence of the creature remained except his photographs, the plaster casts, and the audio recording. Other researchers expressed interest in his findings. A cryptozoology group wanted to mount an expedition to the area. Ozzy declined to guide them. He'd seen what he'd seen. He had evidence that something unusual existed in those woods, but he had no desire to encounter it again. The experience changed how he approached his fieldwork. He no longer worked alone in remote areas. He carried more than just geological equipment now: a satellite phone, an air horn, bear spray, though he doubted it would be effective against what he'd seen. Most importantly, he trusted his instincts now in a way he hadn't before. Science demanded evidence, repeatability, peer review. Ozzy understood that. But science also required acknowledging when something fell outside current understanding. The creature he'd encountered, if it still lived in those mountains, represented a gap in human knowledge, a predator that had learned to avoid human contact so effectively that it existed undetected despite thousands of hikers passing through its territory every year. Sometimes, Ozzy thinks about those 2 hikers he encountered on the trail, how quickly the creature had vanished when other people appeared. He wonders if they ever heard anything unusual in the hours after they passed him, if they ever found tracks they couldn't explain, if they ever felt watched from the shadows between the trees. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, older than almost any other range on Earth. They've had hundreds of millions of years to develop ecosystems we're only beginning to understand. What else lives in those dark hollows and unmapped caves? What other creatures have learned to stay hidden from the people who walk the trails, thinking they know what wilderness means? Ozzy knows the truth now. We don't know. We've cataloged and classified and convinced ourselves we understand the natural world. But understanding and knowing aren't the same thing. And in the spaces between what we've documented and what actually exists, things move through the darkness. Things that scream in frequencies designed to make us run. Things with 3-toed feet and too many joints in their pale arms. Have you ever heard vocalizations in the wilderness that didn't match any known animal? Do you think undiscovered species could still be hiding in remote mountain regions? Renly started her solo through hike on a perfect October morning in 2021. At 29, she'd quit her software engineering job in Seattle specifically for this journey. The Appalachian Trail represented escape from screens, deadlines, and the constant hum of digital existence. She wanted simplicity. She wanted to prove she could handle prolonged isolation. She wanted her thoughts to be her own again, instead of scattered across a dozen applications and platforms. The section between Grayson Highlands and Mount Rogers in Virginia had a reputation for stunning fall colors. Renly reached the area on her 8th day, feeling stronger and more confident than when she'd started. Her body had adjusted to the daily mileage. Her mind had begun to quiet in ways she'd forgotten were possible. She passed the distinctive lightning-struck tree at exactly 7 in the morning. The trunk had been split vertically by some ancient strike, creating a dramatic V-shape that made it impossible to miss. The trail marker beside it indicated she was at mile marker 42 on this section. Renly noted it in her journal, a habit she'd maintained since day 1. She took a photo of the tree with her phone, the autumn sun illuminating the scarred wood beautifully. The morning was cool and clear. She made good time, maintaining a steady pace that ate up miles without exhausting her. The trail followed a ridgeline, with occasional views into the valleys below. Other hikers were sparse this late in the season. She'd seen only 3 people in the past 2 days. The solitude felt earned, almost sacred. At 10 in the morning, Renly passed the lightning-struck tree again. She stopped walking and stared at it. The same dramatic V shape. The same trail marker reading 42, identical to the tree she'd photographed 3 hours earlier. Except that was impossible. Her GPS unit showed she'd traveled 9 miles since 7. The device on her wrist displayed the elevation changes, the distance covered, the calories burned. 9 miles forward along the trail, but here was the tree. Renly pulled out her phone and compared the photo she'd taken at 7 to what stood before her now. Same tree, same angle of sunlight through the split trunk. Even the shadows fell identically. She checked her GPS again. According to the satellite data, she was 9 miles north of where she'd been 3 hours ago. The device showed no errors, no gaps in tracking. A solid line on the map from her starting point to her current location. She touched the tree trunk, feeling the rough bark under her palm. Solid. Real. The trail marker was weathered metal, cool to the touch. Everything physical confirmed she was standing at mile marker 42. But she'd already been here. She'd already passed this exact spot hours ago. Renly decided to continue forward. Maybe there were 2 similar trees. Lightning strikes weren't unique. The trail was over 2,000 miles long. Coincidences happened. Her rational mind supplied these explanations even as something deeper insisted she was lying to herself. 2 hours later, she passed the tree again. This time, panic began to creep in around the edges of her calm. 12 o'clock. 5 hours of hiking since she'd first seen the lightning-struck tree. Her GPS insisted she'd covered 14 miles. But the trail marker still read 42. The tree still split in that same distinctive V. She checked her phone photos. 3 images now. 7 a.m., 10 a.m., and noon. Identical trees and identical lighting. Except the lighting shouldn't be identical. The sun had moved across the sky. Shadows should have shifted. But in each photo, the angle of light was the same. The shadows fell in the same directions. As if time itself was stuck in the same moment despite her watch, insisting hours had passed. Renly sat on a rock near the tree and forced herself to think clearly. She was experiencing something impossible. Either her GPS was malfunctioning in a very specific way, or space itself was behaving incorrectly. The trail should be linear. Point A to point B. She'd been walking consistently forward. There were no loops in this section, no places where the trail doubled back on itself. She ate lunch mechanically, her appetite gone, but her body needing fuel. Other hikers should be coming through. Someone else would see this tree. They could confirm whether this was the same spot, or if somehow 3 identical locations existed along this stretch of trail. At 1:30, Renly started hiking again. She marked the tree with a bright orange bandana tied around a low branch. If she passed it again, she'd know for certain. The bandana was unique, purchased specifically for this hike. There would be no mistaking it. At 3:40, she reached the tree. The orange bandana fluttered in the breeze exactly where she'd tied it. Her hands shook as she checked her GPS for the 4th time. 19 miles covered since 7 a.m. 8 hours of continuous forward motion. The device showed no errors. The satellite signal remained strong. According to every piece of technology she carried, she was making normal progress along the trail. But the tree said otherwise. The bandana said otherwise. The trail marker reading 42 said otherwise. Renly looked up at the sky. The sun hung in the same position it had at 7 a.m., casting the same angle of light through the split trunk, creating the same shadows on the ground. 8 hours had passed on her watch, on her phone, on her GPS. But the sun hadn't moved. She tried calling for help. No signal. That wasn't unusual in mountain terrain. Her satellite communicator could send an emergency beacon, but what would she say? That she was stuck in a loop? That physics had stopped working? They'd think she was having a mental health crisis. Maybe she was. Renly sat at the base of the tree and reviewed everything rationally. Dehydration could cause confusion. So could altitude sickness, though she was only at moderate elevation. Exhaustion played tricks on perception. 8 days of solo hiking, limited social contact, repetitive physical motion. All of it could contribute to disorientation. But her GPS didn't hallucinate. Her camera didn't lie. The photos on her phone showed the same tree, the same lighting, taken at different times according to the metadata. She pulled up the file information: 7 a.m., 10 a.m., noon, 3:40 p.m., all different timestamps, all showing identical images. She decided to stop moving. If the trail was looping somehow, walking would only repeat the pattern. Better to stay at the tree and wait. Eventually, other hikers would come through. Someone would appear, and she could compare notes about location and time. The sun didn't move as afternoon stretched into evening. Renly watched it hang suspended in the same position hour after hour. Her watch advanced. 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m. But the light never changed. The shadows never shifted. The autumn sun remained frozen in its mid-morning position. At 9 p.m., according to her watch, Renly saw another hiker approaching. Relief flooded through her. She stood and waved, calling out a greeting. The figure moved toward her on the trail. As it drew closer, recognition hit like cold water. The hiker was her. Same pack, same clothing, same blonde hair pulled back in the same ponytail. The other Renly walked with the same gait, same posture. She was looking down at the trail, not ahead. She hadn't noticed herself yet. Renly opened her mouth to call out, but no sound came. Her throat had closed with fear. She watched herself approach, watched herself walk with the same tired but determined expression she'd worn all day. The other Renly passed within 10 feet, eyes on the ground, lost in thought. Then she looked up, made eye contact, her face contorted with terror and tears. She grabbed Renly's arm, fingers digging in with desperate strength. "Don't camp at the tree," the other Renly gasped. "Don't stop moving. Don't—" She vanished, not walking away, not running, just gone, like heat shimmer dissipating. Renly stood alone on the trail, her arm still tingling where the grip had been, where her own grip had been. The world shifted. Not physically, but in a way, Renly felt more than saw. The air pressure changed. Colors became slightly more saturated. The sun finally moved, lurching forward in the sky as if making up for lost time. Shadows raced across the ground as hours of frozen time suddenly caught up with themselves. Renly stumbled, dizzy from the sensation of reality reasserting itself. When her vision cleared, she wasn't at the tree anymore. She stood at a trail shelter 15 miles north, according to the marker. Other hikers were there, setting up for the evening. They looked at her curiously as she appeared, seemingly from nowhere. "You okay?" a man asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Renly couldn't answer. She dropped her pack and sat heavily on the shelter's wooden platform. Her GPS unit showed she'd traveled 28 miles that day. Her watch read 9:30 p.m. The sun was setting normally in the west, following its proper arc across the sky. She checked her phone. The photos were still there. 4 images of the lightning-struck tree, all time-stamped differently, all showing identical lighting. Proof that something had happened, or proof that she'd lost her mind. The evidence could support either conclusion. The other hikers at the shelter told her she'd walked right through around noon. They remembered her specifically because she'd seemed focused, hadn't stopped to chat, just waved and continued north. They confirmed she'd appeared normal, coherent, walking at a good pace. But Renly had no memory of that. From her perspective, she'd been at the tree from 7 a.m. until 9:30 p.m., experiencing the same loop repeatedly. But according to witnesses, she'd hiked through normally, covering miles, making progress. She'd existed in 2 states simultaneously, stuck and moving, trapped and free. She never continued her through hike. The next morning, Renly arranged for someone to drive her to the nearest town with a bus station. She went back to Seattle 3 weeks later. The Appalachian Trail had shown her something she couldn't integrate into her understanding of reality. Her phone still contains those photos. She's had the metadata analyzed by a digital forensics expert. The timestamps are legitimate. The images haven't been manipulated. 4 photos of the same tree in the same lighting, taken 8 hours apart. Physical proof of an impossibility. Renly doesn't hike alone anymore. She barely hikes at all. She went back to software engineering, back to screens and deadlines. The digital world might be artificial, but at least it follows rules. At least cause leads to effect in predictable ways. At least when you move forward, you actually get somewhere instead of returning to the same point over and over, while time forgets how to flow. She still thinks about seeing herself on the trail, about the desperate warning to not camp at the tree, about the feeling of her own fingers gripping her arm. Was that a future version of herself somehow? A past version? Or was it proof that in that loop, in that frozen moment, multiple versions of her existed simultaneously, all trapped in the same space, trying desperately to escape? The scientific part of her mind wants to understand, wants to research temporal anomalies and spatial distortions, wants to go back and document everything properly. But the human part, the part that felt genuine terror at meeting herself, refuses. Some mysteries aren't worth solving. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The Appalachian Trail stretches for thousands of miles through ancient mountains. Millions of people have walked it. How many of them experienced something impossible and never spoke about it? How many loops exist along its length, trapping hikers in moments that won't end? How many versions of how many people are still there, stuck at mile markers that refuse to let them pass? Renly doesn't know. She only knows she escaped, and that somewhere in Virginia, a lightning-struck tree stands at mile marker 42, waiting for the next person who won't be able to move past it, waiting to teach them that time and space are more fragile than we believe, that forward isn't always forward, that sometimes the trail leads nowhere but back to itself, forever. Have you ever felt like you were walking in circles even though you knew you were moving forward? What would you do if you met yourself on a trail? Crew was 52 when he discovered the hunting blind in November 1998. A Vietnam veteran who'd learned survival in jungles half a world away, he'd taken to the Appalachian Trail late in life as a way to reclaim the peace those years had stolen. He preferred hiking off-season when the crowds thinned and the mountains returned to something resembling true wilderness. The cold didn't bother him. Neither did solitude. Both felt more honest than the alternative. He'd been section hiking through North Carolina, working his way along a stretch near Fontana Dam. The area was remote, even by trail standards, with long stretches between shelters and limited access points. Most through-hikers had finished their journeys by November. The few who remained were the determined ones, racing against winter to reach Springer Mountain before the worst weather hit. Crew noticed the hunting blind purely by accident. He'd left the trail to filter water from a stream, bushwhacking about a quarter mile through dense rhododendron. The structure sat tucked against a rock outcropping, camouflaged so effectively he almost walked past without seeing it. But something caught his eye, a reflection of light off metal where metal shouldn't be. The blind was well constructed, built from local materials, but showing clear expertise. Branches woven together, covered with natural debris, positioned to overlook a small clearing, illegal on national park land, but that wasn't unusual. Poachers occasionally set up in protected areas, hoping the remoteness would prevent discovery. What made Crew stop wasn't the blind itself. It was what he found inside. A plastic storage container, the kind meant to be weatherproof, sat wedged between the blind's support posts. Crew opened it. Inside were items that turned his blood cold. Driver's licenses, 7 of them, all from different people. A journal with handwritten entries. Several photographs showing hikers on the trail, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. A detailed topographic map with multiple locations marked in red ink. And a compound bow with a quiver of hunting arrows. Crew's hands remained steady as he photographed everything with his disposable camera. His military training had prepared him for documenting evidence. He flipped through the journal, reading entries that described stalking techniques, observation notes about trail traffic patterns, and detailed plans written in methodical handwriting. The most recent entry was dated 4 days ago. It described watching a solo hiker, male, mid-30s, moving slowly due to an injured knee. The entry noted the hiker's vulnerability, his isolation, and the writer's anticipation of the most challenging hunt yet. Crew understood immediately what he'd found. This wasn't about deer or bear. Someone was hunting people on the Appalachian Trail. He closed the container and placed it back exactly as he'd found it. His military instincts took over, assessing the tactical situation. Whoever built this blind would return. The recent journal entry guaranteed that. Crew needed to decide whether to report this to authorities or deal with it himself. Park rangers were hours away. Cell signal was non-existent. By the time help arrived, the hunter could disappear or claim someone else had built the blind. More importantly, Crew thought about the hiker described in that final journal entry, mid-30s, injured knee moving slowly. That person was in danger right now, might already be dead. He made his decision. He'd wait. Crew found a position with good sightlines to the blind, tucked himself into a natural depression behind a fallen log, and settled in for surveillance. He'd done this before in another jungle, another war. The skills returned like muscle memory. Control your breathing. Stay absolutely still. Become part of the landscape. Wait. 6 hours passed. Darkness fell. Crew remained motionless, ignoring cold and discomfort. The moon rose, providing enough light to maintain visibility on the clearing below. Movement. A figure approached the blind from the north, moving with practiced silence through terrain that would challenge most hikers even in daylight. Crew watched through the gathering darkness as a man climbed into the blind, settled into position, and began scanning the surrounding forest with night vision equipment. The hunter was hunting. Crew remained still. He needed to understand the full situation before acting. The man in the blind carried a compound bow and wore camouflage hunting clothes. He appeared to be in his 40s, physically fit, moving with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with these woods. For another hour, nothing happened. Then Crew heard what the hunter had been waiting for. Footsteps on the trail. Someone hiking at night, which was dangerous but not unheard of. Hikers sometimes pushed late to reach a planned shelter or water source. The hunter tensed, drew his bow, sighted along the arrow toward the trail. Crew acted. He'd positioned himself deliberately. Knowing if intervention became necessary, he'd need the tactical advantage. He moved down the slope silently, circling wide to approach the blind from the rear. The hunter's attention remained fixed on the approaching hiker. He never heard Crew coming. Put the bow down. Crew's voice was calm, steady, backed by the absolute certainty of someone who'd given that command before, under worse circumstances. The hunter spun, bow still drawn. In the moonlight, Crew could see his face clearly. Surprise, then calculation. The man was deciding whether he could swing the bow around fast enough. "You won't make it," Crew said. "I've done this longer than you've been alive. Put it down now." The hunter hesitated, then slowly lowered the bow. "You don't understand. This is legal hunting land. I have permits. For people. You have permits to hunt people. I don't know what you're talking about." Crew gestured toward the storage container. "The licenses, the journal, the photographs. I read everything. I know what you've been doing." The hunter's expression changed. The false innocence dropped away, replaced by something colder. "Then you know you're interfering with something bigger than you understand. This isn't your business. I'm making it my business." What happened next happened fast. The hunter grabbed for a knife at his belt. Crew had anticipated it, had seen the subtle shift in body language that preceded the movement. He closed the distance before the blade cleared its sheath, using techniques he'd sworn he'd never need again. The knife ended up in the dirt. The hunter ended up on his stomach with Crew's knee in his back. "Stop fighting," Crew said. "It's over." But it wasn't over. Not yet. For the next 2 days, Crew kept the hunter restrained, using paracord from his pack. He'd checked the man for weapons, finding 2 more knives, a small pistol, and a handheld radio. The radio was interesting. It suggested the hunter might not be working alone. Crew also had to deal with a tactical problem. The injured hiker mentioned in the journal was still out there somewhere, possibly in danger from other members of this hunting operation if it involved multiple people. He needed to get both himself and his prisoner off the mountain, but he also needed to warn any other hikers in the area. He used the hunter's own tripwire system against him, setting up alerts around their position. Then he secured the prisoner to a tree and went through the storage container more thoroughly. What he found documented a pattern spanning at least 3 years. The driver's licenses belonged to hikers who'd been reported missing along various sections of the Appalachian Trail, people who'd simply vanished, assumed lost to accidents or animals, or simply walking away from their lives. The journal contained dates, descriptions, and horrifyingly clinical assessments of each hunt. The writer described tracking techniques, evaluated the challenge level of each target, and rated his own performance with cold precision. On the morning of the 3rd day, Crew hiked the hunter out at knife point. It took 18 hours to reach a point where his emergency whistle attracted the attention of a trail maintenance crew. From there, park rangers were called. Law enforcement arrived. The hunter was taken into custody along with all the evidence from the blind. The investigation that followed was extensive. The hunter, whose name Crew never learned and didn't want to know, had indeed killed 2 hikers in previous years. Their bodies were eventually recovered based on locations marked in the journal. A 3rd hiker, who'd been reported missing, was found alive but traumatized, having escaped into the wilderness and survived for weeks before making it to a ranger station. The trial was straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. The hunter was convicted on multiple counts, including 2 murders. He received consecutive life sentences. Crew testified at the trial, but attended only the days he was required to be present. He didn't want to hear the details of what had been done to those people. Didn't want to understand the psychology behind it. He'd stopped it. That was enough. But it wasn't enough. Not really. Crew never completed his section hike. He went home to Tennessee and discovered he couldn't sleep without seeing that hunting blind in his dreams. Couldn't close his eyes without remembering the cold calculation in the hunter's face when he'd been caught. The man had shown no remorse, no horror at what he'd done, just annoyance at being interrupted. The trauma wasn't new. Crew had carried Vietnam with him for decades. But this was different. This was evil he'd found in the place he'd gone to find peace. The mountains he'd trusted to be separate from human cruelty had been revealed as just another place where people preyed on each other. He eventually sought treatment through the VA. A therapist who specialized in combat trauma listened to his story and asked a question that stayed with him. Why do you think finding this affected you more than your war experiences? Crew thought about it for weeks. The answer, when it came, was simple. In war, everyone knows the danger. Everyone's armed. Everyone's ready. But on the trail, people go to feel safe. They go to escape the violence of the civilized world. They trust the wilderness to be cleaner than humanity. Finding a human predator there, in that sacred space, felt like a deeper betrayal than anything he'd experienced in combat. He does hike again now, years later, but never alone. Always with at least one other veteran, others who understand the necessity of watching each other's backs. They carry more than most hikers do. Better communication equipment, better first aid, and yes, better weapons than just bear spray. Some of his hiking partners think he's paranoid. Maybe he is, but Crew knows something most people don't want to accept. The wilderness isn't separate from human evil. It's just a different venue for it. And the isolation that makes the trail beautiful also makes it perfect for those who hunt in ways that have nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the worst things people can become. The Appalachian Trail is still there, still beautiful, still calling people to walk its length and test themselves against distance and weather and their own limitations. Crew respects that, but he also knows that somewhere out there, someone else might have built another blind, written another journal, collected another set of licenses from people who simply wanted to walk in the woods. The hunter he caught wasn't the first. Crew knows that in his bones. And he probably won't be the last, because the same isolation that draws people seeking peace also draws people seeking prey. And in the vast stretches between shelters, in the remote hollows far from roads, terrible things can happen before anyone even knows to start looking. Do you think there could be other predators operating in remote wilderness areas? Would you feel safe hiking alone after hearing this? London was 23 when she heard the child crying in the laurel thickets. It was mid-July 2012, and she'd been hiking with her boyfriend Zakai, who was 24, through the Roan Highlands near Carver's Gap on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. They'd been dating for 2 years and had planned this section hike as a test of their compatibility before making more serious commitments. So far, the trail had revealed mostly good things about each other. Zakai was patient when London struggled with steep climbs. London kept their spirits up when rain turned the trail to mud. They'd set up camp in a legal spot about 100 yards from the main trail, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by the dense rhododendron tangles that characterized this elevation. The evening had been perfect. Clear sky, mild temperature, the kind of mountain night that reminded you why people fell in love with wilderness. London woke to the sound around 11 p.m. At first, she thought she was dreaming. A child's voice, sobbing, calling out for help. The sound came from somewhere in the laurel thickets to the north of their tent, muffled but distinct. She sat up in her sleeping bag, listening intently. Beside her, Zakai was still asleep, his breathing steady and deep. The crying continued. A young voice, maybe 6 or 7 years old, scared and lost. London unzipped the tent quietly, not wanting to wake Zakai until she understood what was happening. She stood outside in the moonlight, orienting toward the sound. It was definitely a child. The sobbing had words now, though she couldn't make them out clearly, but the desperation in the tone was unmistakable. She grabbed her headlamp and started toward the sound. The laurel was thick, requiring her to push through branches that caught at her clothes and scratched her arms. The crying seemed to move away as she approached, staying just beyond her light's reach. But that made sense if a frightened child was running from a stranger's light in the darkness. "It's okay," London called out. "I'm here to help. Are you lost?" The crying intensified. London pushed deeper into the thicket, her rational mind starting to question why a child would be alone out here at this elevation, this far from any roads or campgrounds. But the emotional response to a child in distress overrode logic. She had to find them, had to help. A hand grabbed her shoulder from behind. London spun, gasping. Zakai stood there, his headlamp illuminating both their faces. "What are you doing?" he asked. "There's a child. Can't you hear it? Someone's lost out here." Zakai listened. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. "I hear it. But London, that doesn't make sense. There are no kids camping in this area. We're miles from anywhere families would bring children. Then they're really lost. We have to find them." They pushed forward together, following the crying deeper into the laurel. The sound always stayed ahead of them, moving whenever. They got close. After 20 minutes of struggling through increasingly dense vegetation, Zakai stopped. "This isn't right," he said. "We need to think about this. A child is crying for help, or something wants us to think that." London stared at him. "You think an animal is making that sound? I don't know what's making it, but nothing about this is normal. Kids don't wander alone at 11,000 feet. And the way it keeps moving, always just out of sight. That's not how a scared child behaves. That's how prey gets lured." The crying stopped abruptly. Complete silence fell over the laurel thicket. Even the normal night sounds of insects and wind seemed muted. London and Zakai stood frozen, headlamps cutting narrow paths through the darkness. Then the crying started again, but from a different direction, back toward their camp. They returned quickly, pushing through branches with more urgency than before. When they reached their clearing, another tent had been set up about 30 yards from theirs. A small backpacking tent, single-person size. A dim light glowed inside. "That wasn't here an hour ago," London whispered. Zakai approached the tent slowly. "Hello? Is someone there? We heard crying. Is everything all right?" No response. The light continued to glow, but nothing moved inside the tent. Zakai reached for the zipper, hesitated, then opened it. Empty. Just a battery-powered lantern sitting in the center of the floor, providing the light they'd seen. No sleeping bag, no gear, no sign anyone had actually used the tent. "We're leaving," Zakai said. "Right now. Pack everything." "It's the middle of the night." "I don't care. Something is very wrong here." As they hurriedly broke down their camp, the crying started again. This time from multiple directions simultaneously. At least 3 different voices, all children, all sobbing and calling for help. The sounds surrounded their clearing, coming from the laurel on all sides. London's hands shook as she stuffed her sleeping bag into its compression sack. The voices were getting closer. She could almost make out words now. "Help me. I'm lost. Please help me." But there was something wrong with the cadence. The phrases repeated exactly, like recordings playing on a loop. Zakai had their tent down in record time. They shouldered their packs and started back toward the main trail, moving as quickly as the darkness and terrain allowed. The crying followed them. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes so close it seemed like the source should be visible in their headlamp beams. But they never saw anything. Just laurel branches swaying in still air. They reached the trail and turned south, hiking fast despite the late hour and poor visibility. Neither spoke. Both were focused on putting distance between themselves and whatever was making those sounds. An hour into their night hike, they encountered other campers. An older couple, probably in their 60s, standing on the trail looking confused and worried. "Did you hear it?" the woman asked immediately. "The children crying." Relief flooded through London. They weren't imagining it. Others had heard the same thing. "We've been hearing it for years," the man said. "We try to warn people, but nobody believes us until they hear it themselves. Been camping in these highlands for 20 years. That sound shows up every few seasons." "What is it?" Zakai asked. The couple exchanged glances. "We've got theories," the woman said, "but no proof. Just stories and old records." They hiked together to the next shelter, safety in numbers. As they walked, the older couple shared what they knew. Local legend spoke of a cabin fire in 1923. A family had lived in these mountains, subsistence farmers scratching out an existence in the thin soil. A winter fire had killed everyone. The parents and 3 children had died in the flames, but the youngest daughter, a 6-year-old named Sarah, had escaped. She'd fled into the laurel thickets, wearing only a nightgown in freezing temperatures. Search parties looked for weeks, but never found her body. The assumption was she'd died from exposure somewhere in the dense vegetation. Her remains had never been recovered. "People have been hearing a child crying in these laurels ever since," the man said. "Usually in summer, around the anniversary of the fire. Some folks think it's Sarah, still lost, still calling for help." At the shelter, they met 2 more hikers who'd also heard the crying. One had been camping in the area for 3 nights and reported hearing it each evening. Always around 11 p.m., always from the laurel thickets, always moving away when approached. London barely slept the rest of that night. She kept thinking about a 6-year-old girl dying alone in the cold, crying for help that never came. If it really was Sarah's spirit, still trapped here almost 90 years later, didn't she deserve to be found, to be put to rest? The next morning, London made a decision. She and Zakai would help. They'd research the story, find the exact location of the cabin, try to locate Sarah's remains. It seemed like the right thing to do. The human thing to do. It took them 3 months of research, county records, newspaper archives, interviews with local historical societies. They found the cabin's location, marked on old property surveys. They obtained permission from the National Park Service to conduct a search with ground-penetrating radar equipment. They returned to the Roan Highlands in October with a team from a local historical society and a forensic anthropologist. Using the old property records and the GPR equipment, they searched the laurel thickets systematically. They found Sarah in a dense hollow about a quarter mile from where the cabin had stood. Her remains were small, curled in a fetal position beneath decades of fallen leaves. She'd made it further than anyone had thought possible for a child in a nightgown in winter, but not far enough to survive. The local community arranged a proper burial. Sarah's remains were interred in a small cemetery near where the cabin had been. A marker was placed with her name and dates. A ceremony was held acknowledging her story and the tragedy of her family. London and Zakai attended, along with the older couple who'd shared the legend and several other hikers who'd heard the crying over the years. The forensic anthropologist spoke about Sarah's life based on what the bones had revealed. She'd been small for her age, possibly malnourished. She'd suffered a healed fracture in her left arm sometime before her death. She'd been scared and alone when she died. After the burial, London returned to the Highlands multiple times. She camped in the same clearing where she'd first heard the crying. She listened carefully through the nights. Nothing. Just normal forest sounds. Wind in the trees. Insects chirping. The peaceful quiet of mountains at rest. Other hikers confirmed the same. The crying had stopped. Whatever had been calling from the laurel thickets was silent now. Sarah had finally been found. Finally been given the dignity of recognition and proper burial. Her story had been told. She wasn't forgotten anymore. London thinks about that summer night often, about how close she came to dismissing the sound as imagination or animal calls, about how many other people, over almost 90 years, had heard Sarah crying and done nothing, about how easy it would have been to let the mystery remain unsolved. But she also thinks about the responsibility that comes with hearing someone cry for help, even if that someone has been dead for decades, even if the help they need isn't rescue but simply acknowledgement, memory, the confirmation that their suffering mattered to someone. The Appalachian Trail passes through layers of history. Every mile contains stories of people who lived and died in these mountains. Most of those stories are lost, buried beneath time and leaves and new growth. But sometimes, if you listen carefully, those stories find ways to be heard, ways to remind us that wilderness isn't empty space. It's full of memory, full of the echoes of lives lived in hardship and ended in tragedy. Sarah's story had a resolution. She was found. She was honored. She was given peace. But London wonders how many other voices call from the mountains, unheard or ignored. How many other mysteries wait in the laurel thickets and hollow places, hoping someone will care enough to listen. Have you ever heard sounds in the wilderness that you couldn't explain? Do you believe places can hold on to tragedy and cry out for resolution? Azriel had been a botanist for 9 years when he found the valley in August 2023. At 31, he'd built a reputation for discovering rare plant specimens in remote Appalachian locations. His work focused on endangered species documentation, which meant hiking far beyond marked trails into wilderness areas most people never saw. He worked alone by preference, finding that solitude allowed better observation of delicate ecosystems that human traffic could easily disturb. The valley wasn't marked on his topographic maps. He'd been searching for a specific type of rare orchid reported in the Hot Springs area of North Carolina when he noticed an unusual gap in the ridgeline. Geographic features that didn't appear on maps always interested him. They suggested isolated microclimates where unusual species might thrive undisturbed. The descent into the valley was steep, requiring him to rope down a rocky cliff face. As he dropped below the ridgeline, the temperature shifted noticeably, warmer, more humid. The air felt thick in a way that reminded him of greenhouses rather than mountain forests. What he found at the valley floor stopped him completely. The vegetation was wrong, not sick or dying, but wrong in fundamental ways that violated his understanding of regional botany. Species that shouldn't coexist were growing in dense tangles. Plants from different climate zones, different altitudes, different soil conditions, all thriving together in combinations that made no biological sense. Asriel moved through the valley slowly, documenting everything with his camera and field notebook. Oak species native to lower elevations grew beside alpine flowers that required freezing temperatures. Ferns from tropical climates wrapped around mountain laurel. A type of orchid he'd only seen in Florida grew next to moss species that shouldn't survive outside of northern Canada, but the strangest feature stood in the valley center, a flowering structure unlike anything in his botanical reference materials. It rose about 12 feet high, thick as a mature tree trunk, but clearly not wooden. The surface had a fleshy quality, slightly translucent, with visible fluid moving through internal channels. The top spread into a massive bloom, with petals arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when he looked at them directly. The flower, if it could be called that, emitted a visible cloud of pollen. Golden particles drifted through the valley like slow snow, coating everything with a fine dust. Asriel pulled out his particle mask, intending to protect his lungs from unknown allergens. But before he could put it on, the pollen reached him. Sweet smell, almost overwhelming. His hand paused halfway to his face. The mask suddenly seemed unnecessary. Everything seemed peaceful, safe, beautiful. Asriel lowered his hand. The mask fell from his fingers into the leaf litter. He walked toward the massive flower, drawn by curiosity that felt natural but wasn't. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, a small voice screamed warnings, but that voice was distant, muffled, easy to ignore. He reached out and touched the flower's surface. It felt warm, alive. The texture reminded him of skin more than plant tissue. His fingers sank slightly into the surface, and immediately he felt something pushing back. Not painful, but invasive. Like the flower was tasting him, learning him. Hours passed. Asriel had no memory of them later. He came back to awareness, sitting at the base of the flower, his back against its trunk. The sun had moved across the sky. According to his watch, 4 hours had vanished. His arm hurt. He looked down and felt his stomach lurch. His right forearm, the one he'd used to touch the flower, was covered in a rash, but not a normal rash. The skin was raised in patterns that looked almost deliberate, lines and swirls that branched like root systems. As he watched, the patterns moved slightly, growing, spreading. Panic cut through the peaceful fog that had settled over his thoughts. Asriel stood quickly, stumbling as his legs remembered how to work. He needed to leave, needed to get out of this valley immediately. The climb out was harder than the descent. His infected arm throbbed with each movement. The rash had spread to his shoulder by the time he reached the top of the cliff. He rappelled up, using his left hand primarily, his right arm growing weaker as whatever was happening to it progressed. By the time he reached his vehicle at the trailhead, the root-like patterns had reached his chest. He could feel them under his skin, moving through tissue in ways that should have been agonizing but instead felt strangely numb, disconnected from his body. Asriel drove himself to the nearest emergency room, a small rural hospital 40 minutes away. The ER doctor took one look at his arm and called for a dermatologist consult, then an infectious disease specialist, then a botanist from the local university who happened to be on call as a poison control consultant. They took samples, ran tests, examined the spreading patterns under microscopes. What they found made no sense to anyone in the room. The rash wasn't a rash. It was actual plant matter growing under his skin. Microscopic examination showed cellular structures that were definitely botanical in nature, but they were integrated with his own cells in ways that shouldn't be possible. The plant material and human tissue had merged at a molecular level, creating something that was neither fully plant nor fully human. More disturbing were the chemical compounds they detected in his bloodstream, complex organic molecules that didn't match any known plant toxins. The structures suggested pheromone production, communication chemicals, like the compounds certain plants released to coordinate with other members of their species. "It's trying to make you part of a network," the university botanist said, his voice uncertain. "Plants communicate through chemical signals and root systems. Whatever infected you seems to be attempting to establish you as a node in some kind of botanical hive mind." They tried to remove the growth surgically, cut away the infected tissue, and hoped his body could heal normally. But within hours of the surgery, new growth appeared. Faster than before, the pattern spread across his chest, down his left arm, up his neck toward his face. Azrael spent 3 days in the hospital while specialists tried increasingly desperate treatments: antifungals, antibiotics, antiparasitics, chemotherapy agents used to kill rapidly dividing cells. Nothing slowed the growth. If anything, aggressive treatment seemed to accelerate it. On the 4th day, Azrael felt the change in his thoughts, subtle at first. A pulling sensation toward the south, toward the mountains, toward the valley. He recognized it as the same compulsion that had made him touch the flower, the same artificial peace that had made him lower his mask. Whatever was growing in him wanted to go back, and it was using his own neurology to create that desire. He checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice, told the doctors he needed to research the site where he'd been infected. That understanding the source might help find a treatment. They reluctantly agreed to let him go with the understanding he'd return for monitoring. Azrael didn't go back to the valley. He went home to Virginia and tried to resist the pull, but resisting became harder each day. The root patterns continued to spread. They reached his scalp, creating visible lines under his skin like veins, but green instead of blue. His left eye developed a faint discoloration in the iris. When he looked in the mirror, he could see golden flecks, pollen-colored. The dreams started 2 weeks after his infection. Not nightmares, exactly, more like visions. He saw the valley from above, as if he were a bird, saw the massive flower in its center, saw other valleys scattered throughout the Appalachian Range, dozens of them, each with its own central flower, each connected somehow through underground networks that spanned hundreds of miles. In the dreams, he could feel the other nodes, people who'd been infected before him, hikers, rangers, researchers, all of them carrying the plant matter in their bodies, all of them connected to the network, whether they wanted to be or not. Azrael researched obsessively, fighting the growing fog in his mind. He found scattered reports going back decades. Hikers who disappeared in remote areas and returned weeks later with no memory of where they'd been. People who'd developed strange rashes that doctors couldn't explain. Entire families who'd moved away from the Appalachians suddenly, abandoning homes and jobs with no clear reason. He found one case study from 1987, a park ranger who'd reported finding an unusual valley with non-native plant species. The ranger had touched something he shouldn't have, developed a spreading rash. Within a month, he'd resigned from his position and moved to the Pacific Northwest. His final medical report before leaving had noted unusual chemical compounds in his blood that couldn't be identified. Azrael tried to contact the ranger, found an obituary instead. The man had died 3 years ago. The cause of death was listed as organ failure, but the description mentioned unusual plant-like growths found throughout his body during autopsy. That's what waited for him. Eventual consumption from the inside, transformation from human to something else, a mobile extension of a botanical entity that had been growing in these mountains for who knew how long. He contacted the National Park Service with his findings, sent them GPS coordinates for the valley. detailed descriptions of the plant species and the central flower, medical records documenting his infection. He urged them to investigate, to quarantine the area, to warn hikers about the danger. The response was polite but dismissive. They'd send a team to investigate when resources permitted. In the meantime, they suggested he continue seeking medical treatment for what was likely an unusual allergic reaction. Asriel knew they wouldn't find the valley. Something about it resisted discovery. The gap in the ridgeline would seem like normal terrain to anyone not already drawn to it. The entity was old, patient, smart enough to stay hidden. 3 months after his infection, Asriel still fights against the compulsion to return. The root patterns have covered most of his body now, visible through his skin when the light hits correctly. His thoughts are increasingly not his own. He'll start thinking about something ordinary and suddenly find himself planning a route back to hot springs, back to the valley, back to the flower that's calling him home. He's documented everything, written detailed accounts of his experience, created maps marking every location where he suspects similar valleys might exist based on his research and the dreams the network sends him. He's uploaded everything to multiple servers with instructions to release the information publicly if he disappears, because he knows he will disappear eventually. The pull is too strong, the infection too advanced. Already he can feel the spores developing in his lungs. Soon he'll exhale golden pollen like the flower does. Soon he'll become a vector for spreading the infection to others. The entity is patient. It's been in these mountains since before humans walked here. It's learned to be subtle, to take hosts slowly, to spread through generations without revealing itself fully. Asriel is just one more node in a network that extends through the entire Appalachian range. Sometimes he wonders if he should go back willingly, if resistance only prolongs the inevitable. The dreams show him what full integration looks like. No more fighting, no more fear, just existence as part of something larger than himself. The entity isn't evil. It doesn't hate or hurt deliberately. It's simply doing what all organisms do, surviving, reproducing, spreading. But Asriel's human mind rejects that comfort, rejects the idea of losing himself to botanical consciousness. He wants to remain separate, individual, human, even if that means suffering through the progressive transformation. He still conducts research, still documents plant species, but he works in other states now, far from Appalachia, trying to stay away from the mountains that call to him with chemical voices his body understands even as his mind refuses to listen. The infection continues to spread. Treatment options remain non-existent. Medical professionals who examine him now use words like unprecedented and impossible. They take samples for research, but offer no hope for reversal or even slowing the progression. Asriel estimates he has maybe 6 months before the transformation becomes too advanced to hide, before the golden flecks in his eye become obvious enough that people notice, before the compulsion to return to the valley becomes impossible to resist. He's made peace with it mostly. He's a scientist. He understands that nature doesn't care about human categories like life and death, host and parasite, individual and collective. The entity in the mountains is simply life, taking a form humans don't recognize or accept. But he also wants others to know, to understand the danger, to recognize that the Appalachian wilderness contains more than bears and snakes, contains intelligence that operates on timescales and through mechanisms we're not equipped to perceive. Somewhere in the hot springs area of North Carolina, a valley exists that isn't on maps. In that valley, a flower blooms that shouldn't be possible, and throughout the Appalachian range, people carry pieces of that flower in their bodies, walking nodes in a network that grows stronger and more widespread with each passing year. The mountains are ancient. They hold secrets humans have never discovered, and some of those secrets are waiting patiently for us to find them. or for them to find us. Have you ever felt an unexplainable pull toward a specific location in nature? What would you do if you discovered something growing inside you that you couldn't remove? Sylvie had been documenting thru hikers for 3 years when she disappeared in March 2017. At 38, she'd built a successful career as a professional photographer, specializing in long-form projects that captured the human experience in extreme environments. The Appalachian Trail represented her most ambitious work yet. She'd planned to spend an entire hiking season following different thru hikers, documenting their journeys from Georgia to Maine. Her equipment was found abandoned near Springer Mountain, the southern terminus, on March 23rd. A day hiker discovered the camera bag sitting beside the trail, expensive lenses scattered around it as if dropped in haste. Sylvie's professional camera body was there, along with her backup equipment and multiple memory cards. Her phone was found 15 feet away in the undergrowth, battery dead, but otherwise undamaged. The search began immediately. Park rangers, volunteers, and search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks. They found no trace of Sylvie beyond the abandoned equipment. No signs of struggle, no blood, no clothing. Nothing to indicate what had happened or which direction she might have gone. What they did find was the footage. The memory cards contained the final days of Sylvie's documentation project. Rangers reviewed the material, hoping for clues about her disappearance. What they found was far more disturbing than a simple missing person case. The footage from the first 3 days appeared normal. Sylvie had interviewed several thru hikers beginning their northbound journeys. The videos showed standard documentary work, questions about motivations for hiking, preparations they'd made, fears and expectations they carried. Her subjects were articulate and engaging. The footage was professionally composed and well lit. Nothing unusual. Day 4 was when things changed. In the background of an interview with a young man discussing his reasons for attempting a thru hike, a figure appeared. Distant, barely visible in the frame, standing motionless among the trees about 50 yards behind the subject. The figure was tall and wore dark clothing. Nothing immediately alarming, just another hiker in the area. But the same figure appeared in the next interview, shot an hour later. Same distance, same position relative to the camera, standing motionless. The location had changed. Sylvie had moved to a different part of the trail to interview a different subject, but the figure maintained the same spatial relationship to her camera, as if it had followed and repositioned itself deliberately. The rangers noted this, but didn't consider it conclusive evidence of anything threatening. The Appalachian Trail was public land. People stood around. Coincidences happened. The Day 5 footage was more concerning. Every shot contained the figure. Morning interviews, afternoon hiking footage, evening camp scenes. Always in the background. Always the same approximate distance. Always motionless. But the figure had moved closer. Now only about 30 yards away in most shots. Sylvie's audio commentary suggested she'd noticed. Between interview segments, her voice noted the presence of someone who seemed to be following her. She'd tried to approach the figure once. The footage showed her walking toward it, with her camera running. The figure remained still until she got within 20 feet, then simply wasn't there anymore. The video showed empty forest where the figure had been standing a moment before. Sylvie's voice on the audio. "Okay, that was strange. I'm not sure what I just saw. Camera shows the person clearly, but when I get close, nothing. Maybe a trick of light and shadows. I'm going to keep documenting but stay more aware of my surroundings." Day 6 was when the figure's appearance changed. In the morning footage, it stood at its usual distance, but the camera had captured more detail. The figure wore dark clothing, but there was something wrong with the proportions. Too tall, too thin. The head seemed too large for the body. When Sylvie zoomed in on one shot, trying to get a clearer image, the figure had no face. The head was smooth, featureless, just blank skin where eyes and mouth should be. Sylvie's audio commentary became more agitated. I'm documenting something I don't understand. The person or thing that's been following me doesn't have a face. I know how that sounds. I know what the footage shows might be explainable. Bad focus, distance, lighting. But I've been a photographer for 15 years. I know what I'm seeing through my lens. This isn't normal. The day 6 footage showed Sylvie interviewing hikers, while obviously distracted. She kept glancing toward where the figure stood. Some of her subjects noticed her distraction and asked if she was all right. She assured them she was fine, just tired from long days of hiking and filming. But in one segment, when she turned her camera to capture B-roll footage of the forest, she caught something chilling. There were now 3 figures, all standing at different distances, all motionless, all facing her direction, all with smooth, featureless heads where faces should be. Sylvie's breathing audibly quickened on the audio. She panned the camera slowly, documenting all 3 figures. Then she turned it to face herself, recording a direct message. March 20th, 4 p.m. I'm being followed by multiple entities that I cannot identify. They appear human-shaped, but lack facial features. They maintain consistent distance, but multiply in number. I've attempted to approach. They vanish when I get close. I'm documenting everything in case something happens to me. If someone finds this footage, please know I'm not experiencing a mental health crisis. I'm a professional documenter. I record what I see, and what I see is impossible. Day 7 was the final day of footage. The morning video showed Sylvie's tent from the outside. She'd set her camera on a tripod, filming continuously through the night. The footage was in night vision mode, showing the greenish monochrome typical of low-light recording. For the first 3 hours, nothing moved. Just Sylvie's tent in the frame, the forest around it still and silent. At 3 a.m., according to the timestamp, the figures appeared. 7 of them now, arranged in a semicircle around the tent. They stood motionless, facing the camera. The night vision mode captured them clearly. Tall, thin, human-shaped, but proportioned wrong. Completely featureless faces tilted toward the tent as if watching. They remained motionless for 47 minutes. Then, simultaneously, they all began walking toward the tent. Slow, synchronized steps, moving together like a coordinated unit. The camera captured every step as they approached. When they reached the tent, they stopped. One of them reached out with an elongated arm and touched the tent fabric. The camera angle couldn't show what happened inside, but the tent began to collapse as if something was pulling it down from within. Then the audio captured whispers, multiple voices speaking in overlapping tones. The words were indistinct, but the effect was deeply unsettling. Not quite human vocalization. More like recordings of human speech played backwards and layered over each other. The tent fabric moved. Something was struggling inside. The figures remained motionless, all oriented toward the tent. The struggling continued for nearly 2 minutes before stopping abruptly. The tent flap opened from inside. The camera captured what emerged. Boots. Sylvie's hiking boots, clearly visible and recognizable from earlier footage. They walked out of the tent, empty, no legs inside them. Just the boots moving on their own, stepping in natural walking rhythm. They moved past the camera, continued down the trail, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the night vision's range. The figures remained around the collapsed tent for another hour, motionless. Then they dispersed in different directions, walking backward into the forest. Within minutes, they'd all vanished from frame. Morning came. The camera continued recording. Dawn light revealed the collapsed tent, Sylvie's scattered gear, and no sign of her. At 7 a.m., a hiker passed on the trail. The person noticed the camera on its tripod, still recording, and approached to investigate. That's where the footage ended. The rangers who reviewed this material were deeply disturbed. They brought in specialists. Video forensics experts examined every frame, looking for evidence of manipulation or hoaxing. The footage was authentic. No signs of editing or digital manipulation. Whatever the camera had recorded actually happened in front of the lens. The question was, what had actually happened? The faceless figures didn't match any known animal or common hiking activity. The synchronized movement suggested intelligence and coordination. The whispers captured on audio were analyzed by acoustic specialists who found them to be actual human voice frequencies, but arranged in patterns that no human vocal structure could produce naturally. Most disturbing was the final image of the boots walking away empty. Multiple specialists confirmed the footage was genuine. The boots moved with natural walking motion, weight shifting correctly, stepping over obstacles in the path. But they were unquestionably empty. The search for Sylvie intensified after the footage was reviewed. Dogs tracked from the campsite. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over hundreds of square miles. Volunteer teams hiked every trail and off-trail area within a 20-mile radius. They found nothing. 3 days after the equipment was discovered, another hiker reported seeing a woman matching Sylvie's description on the trail about 8 miles north of Springer Mountain. The witness said the woman seemed fine, hiking normally, and had waved when they made eye contact. The witness thought nothing of it until seeing the missing person reports. Other sightings followed. Over the next 2 weeks, 4 different hikers reported seeing Sylvie on various sections of trail. Each witness described her as appearing normal and healthy, walking steadily, sometimes carrying a pack, sometimes not. When approached, she'd smile but continue hiking without stopping to talk. Rangers investigated each sighting location immediately. Found nothing. No footprints matching her boots. No evidence she'd been in those areas. But the witnesses were credible, detailed, certain of what they'd seen. The sightings continued sporadically over the following months. A dozen reports came in from different sections of the Appalachian Trail: Virginia, Tennessee, Pennsylvania. Each time, witnesses described the same woman. Same physical description matching Sylvie. Same calm demeanor. Same tendency to avoid conversation while remaining friendly and visible. But Sylvie's family confirmed she never contacted them. Her bank accounts showed no activity. Her phone never pinged cell towers. Every attempt to verify the sightings led to dead ends. In June, 4 months after her disappearance, a hiker captured a photograph, a random trail photo taken to document the view from a ridge in Maryland. The background of the image showed other hikers on the trail below. When the photographer reviewed his pictures later, he noticed one of the hikers matched the description from the missing person bulletins. The photograph clearly showed Sylvie. Same face, same build, same hiking clothing she'd been wearing when she disappeared. But there was something wrong with the image. She appeared slightly translucent, not fully solid, and in the background behind her, barely visible, stood one of the faceless figures from her footage. The photographer reported the image to authorities. Forensics confirmed the photo was genuine and unmanipulated, but they couldn't explain how someone could appear translucent in a standard photograph. Light exposure issues could create that effect, but nothing in the technical data suggested any camera malfunction. More photographs emerged over the summer. Different hikers, different locations, all captured images of Sylvie on the trail. In some, she appeared normal. In others, slightly translucent or oddly proportioned. And in nearly every image, if you looked carefully at the background, the faceless figures appeared. Sometimes just one, sometimes several. Always maintaining distance, always oriented toward her. The official investigation remains open. Sylvie is still listed as missing, but the National Park Service has quietly circulated internal memos about the case. They advise rangers not to approach anyone matching her description alone. They recommend documenting sightings with photographs, but maintaining distance. They acknowledge, without explaining, that the situation is unusual and potentially dangerous. Hikers who've captured photographs of Sylvie and posted them online report strange experiences afterward. Dreams of faceless figures standing outside their homes. sounds of whispers in empty rooms, feelings of being watched during otherwise normal activities. Most dismiss these as psychological responses to learning about a disturbing case. But some report more concrete manifestations. One photographer, who captured an image of Sylvie in Pennsylvania, reported that his camera began malfunctioning the day after taking the photo. Every image he took, regardless of subject or location, included figures in the background. Tall, thin, faceless. His camera was examined by technicians who found nothing wrong with it. But the phenomenon continued until he deleted the Sylvie photograph from his memory card. The trail community has developed an unofficial protocol. If you see someone matching Sylvie's description, acknowledge her, but don't approach. Don't try to help. Don't ask questions. Just let her pass and continue your hike. And absolutely don't photograph her if you can avoid it. Because something walks the Appalachian Trail wearing Sylvie's face. Something that appears in dozens of locations simultaneously. Something accompanied by entities that have no faces and speak in layered whispers. Something that was human once, but isn't anymore. Or something that never was human, but learned to look like it. The footage from her final night exists in evidence storage. Law enforcement occasionally reviews it, hoping to find some detail they missed. But every viewing only reinforces the disturbing reality that something impossible occurred, that a woman was taken by things that shouldn't exist, that she now appears on a trail she can never leave, walking forever in multiple places at once, smiling at hikers who will never understand what they've really seen. Have you ever seen someone on a trail who seemed just slightly wrong in ways you couldn't explain? Would you approach them or keep your distance? Finley woke up in a psychiatric facility without knowing how she'd gotten there. The last clear memory she possessed was standing in fog near Daleville, Virginia in December 2020. She'd been 45 then, trying to escape the wreckage of her divorce through a solo winter hike. Everything after that fog was fragmented. Pieces of memory that didn't connect properly, like a film with scenes missing. The staff at the facility treated her kindly but with careful distance, the way people treat someone who might become unpredictable. They told her she'd been a patient for 3 years, that her family had admitted her following a complete mental breakdown during her hiking trip, that the Appalachian Trail, she remembered, had been the hospital grounds all along. Finley sat in group therapy sessions listening to other patients discuss their delusions and couldn't reconcile what they told her with what she remembered. She remembered mountains. Real mountains with elevation changes that made her legs burn and her lungs work harder. She remembered shelters where other hikers slept. She remembered the particular cold of December in the Virginia highlands. But the doctors showed her security footage, video of her wandering the hospital grounds, talking to people who weren't there, setting up her tent on the lawn, going through the motions of hiking while walking in circles around the facility perimeter. The footage was dated across months, a comprehensive document of delusion. Her ex-husband visited once, early in her stay at the facility, though she barely remembered it now. The doctors said he'd been supportive but devastated, that he'd blamed himself for not recognizing her deteriorating mental state before she'd attempted the hike that had broken her completely. He'd moved on since then, they told her gently. Remarried. Started a new life. He wished her well but couldn't be part of her recovery. Finley accepted this information the way she accepted everything else, with a kind of numb confusion that felt permanent. The medication helped, they said, kept her stable, prevented the episodes where she'd insist on preparing for the next day's hike, or refused to come inside because she needed to reach a shelter before dark. She participated in art therapy, creating watercolor paintings of mountain landscapes she insisted she'd seen. The therapist praised her imagination, while gently redirecting her toward processing her divorce trauma, instead of retreating into wilderness fantasy. She joined the facility's walking group, sanctioned exercise around the grounds. The other patients chatted about their lives before hospitalization, jobs they'd had, families they missed, Finley walked quietly, feeling the pavement under her feet and remembering the sensation of trail dirt, though she couldn't trust whether that memory was real. 6 months into treatment, Finley had accepted the narrative the facility provided. She'd suffered a breakdown, created an elaborate hiking fantasy to escape emotional pain. The mountains existed only in her fractured mind. Recovery meant accepting reality, even when reality felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Then she saw the photograph. It appeared during a recreational activity. Patients could use tablets with supervised internet access for limited periods. Finley was scrolling through news articles when an advertisement caught her attention. Hiking gear company promoting Appalachian Trail equipment. The ad featured a photograph of a shelter. She recognized it immediately. The 3-sided stone structure, the way the sleeping platform was elevated, the specific pattern of damage on the wooden planks. She'd slept there. She knew she'd slept there, though according to her medical records, she'd never left the facility grounds. Finley zoomed in on the photo, hands shaking. In the background, barely visible, a figure stood near the tree line. Small in the frame, easy to miss, but Finley's vision tunneled on that figure. Same build as her, same jacket she remembered wearing. The timestamp on the article showed it had been published 2 years ago, during the time she was supposedly hospitalized. She said nothing to the staff. Requesting to see the tablet again the next day, she searched for more Appalachian Trail images. Found a hiking blog from 2021, a post about unusual encounters on the trail. One of the photos showed hikers at a shelter, and there, in the far background, was the same figure. Same jacket, same build. Her, but not her. Standing in a place she'd supposedly never been during a time she was supposedly medicated in a facility. The discovery should have destabilized her, should have triggered the kind of episode her charts documented. But instead, Finley felt clarity settling over her like cold water. Something was profoundly wrong, and it wasn't her mental state. She began investigating carefully, observing the facility with new attention, noticed things she'd previously dismissed as normal institutional routine. The way staff always redirected certain questions, how some hallways led to areas patients never accessed. The fact that despite supposedly being there for 3 years, she'd never seen anyone discharged. Never seen new patients arrive beyond the same 15 people who attended group sessions. She tested boundaries subtly. Asked a nurse about the facility's name. The nurse told her Riverside Recovery Center. But when she checked the mail she'd supposedly received from her ex-husband, the return address listed a different facility name entirely. Mountain View Treatment Hospital. She examined the security footage they'd shown her during therapy sessions, asked to see it again under the pretense of processing her delusions, watched herself walking in circles on the grounds. But something about the motion was wrong, too fluid, too perfect, like computer animation rather than actual human movement. Finley started refusing some of her medication, palming pills, and disposing of them when staff weren't watching. The clarity increased. The fog that had settled over her thoughts thinned, and with that clarity came memories that didn't match the institutional narrative. She remembered hiking. Actually hiking, not walking in circles. Remembered the fog near Daleville being thick and disorienting. Remembered taking a wrong turn and finding a small town that wasn't on her map. People in that town had been friendly. Too friendly, insisting she stay, rest, recover from her journey. They'd known things about her they shouldn't have known, details about her divorce, her reasons for hiking, her fears and vulnerabilities. She'd tried to leave multiple times, always ended up back in the town center somehow. The geography hadn't made sense. Roads that should lead away curved back to the same point. Trail markers contradicted her GPS. The sun stayed in the same position for hours. Then there had been the discovery in the town historical society. She'd gone there looking for maps, found a photograph from the 1950s, a group photo of the town residents. And she was in it. Same face, same body. Different name listed in the caption, but definitely her. Standing with people who should have been her grandparents' generation. She'd confronted the mayor about it. Been told she'd always been there, that she just got confused sometimes, that the confusion was why she needed help. They'd shown her documentation, medical records proving she was a long-term resident, psychiatric evaluations spanning years. That's when she tried to run, physically forced her way past the friendly townspeople and bolted into the forest. Had crashed through undergrowth for hours until exhaustion and disorientation overwhelmed her, and woken up here, in this facility, with staff telling her a different story. But the structure was the same. The gaslighting was the same. Reality being rewritten around her while insisting she was the one who couldn't see clearly. Finley spent weeks observing before taking action. She noticed the facility had patterns, staff rotations that created brief windows where hallways went unmonitored, doors that should be locked but occasionally weren't. The systematic nature suggested the security wasn't actually meant to keep people in. It was meant to create the appearance of institutional authority. She planned her verification attempt carefully, waited for a staff rotation gap, slipped into the administrative wing she'd seen but never entered, found an office with records. Her file was there, but it was wrong. The admission date kept changing. Sometimes it said 3 years ago, sometimes 5. Sometimes the decade was different entirely. Flipping through pages, the dates shifted as she watched. 2020 became 1985, became 2003, became 1967. The text describing her condition rewrote itself mid-sentence. Other files showed similar anomalies. Patients she recognized from group therapy had records spanning impossible timeframes. One woman's file showed continuous hospitalization since 1923. Another man's records dated back to 1889, all of them supposedly being treated for delusions about the Appalachian Trail. Finley photographed everything with a camera she'd taken from a supply closet. Digital evidence that might resist the reality manipulation she was experiencing. Then she searched for exit routes. The facility's blueprint hung framed in the office, labeled as historic architecture from 1950. But looking at it, Finley realized the layout was impossible. Hallways connected in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. Rooms existed in spaces that should be exterior walls. The building was bigger on the inside than it could possibly be from the outside. She heard footsteps, staff returning. Finley hid in a storage closet, holding her breath while 2 orderlies passed. Their conversation chilled her. "The new integration is resisting well," one said. "Stronger pattern recognition than usual. Should we adjust her baseline, make the facility narrative more consistent?" "No. The doctor wants to see how long she can maintain doubt. It's useful data for the others." They moved past. Finley waited 10 minutes before emerging, made her way back to her room without encountering anyone. Lay in bed, reviewing what she'd learned. The facility wasn't real. Or it was real, but not what it pretended to be. She'd been taken from the trail, trapped in something that wore the appearance of psychiatric care while actually studying her, testing her ability to resist false reality. But why? And who was running this? Over the following days, Finley watched the other patients more carefully. Noticed that some seemed aware, like her. Noticed subtle exchanges, glances that suggested shared knowledge. She wasn't the only one who'd figured out something was wrong. She approached one of them carefully, a woman who'd been at the facility longer than anyone according to the shifting records. Asked her quietly during a walking session if she'd ever tried to leave. The woman looked at her with eyes that held decades of exhaustion. "You can't leave. Not really. This place exists outside normal geography, outside normal time. We're all here because we saw something we shouldn't have. The trail showed us gaps. Spaces where reality doesn't work right. This is where they put people who notice. Who are they? Does it matter? something old, something that maintains the boundaries between what people believe is possible and what actually exists. We crossed those boundaries. This is quarantine. Finley processed this. So we're here forever. Most of us. Some get released eventually, but they're not the same when they leave. Something's been adjusted in them. They stop asking questions, stop noticing inconsistencies. They're released back into normal reality, but they're not fully real anymore, just going through the motions. That night, Finley examined her room more carefully, found scratches on the wall, behind her bed, dozens of tally marks, dates carved into the paint. The earliest date was 1952. The same bed, the same room, occupied by patients across 70 years, all counting days that didn't pass in any meaningful way. She added her own mark, December 2020, to present, however long present had actually been. The next morning during group therapy, Finley noticed something new. A photograph hung on the wall that hadn't been there before. A group photo of the facility staff from 1955. The faces were the same as the current staff. Identical, not family resemblance. The exact same people, not aging, maintaining this place across decades. She met the therapist's eyes, saw recognition there, saw the therapist knowing that she knew. The therapist smiled, not unkindly. You're adjusting well, Finley, making progress in accepting your situation. Which situation? The delusion you want me to believe, or the reality you're hiding? Does it matter? You're here either way. The question is whether you spend that time fighting or adapting. What did I see on the trail? What did I do wrong? The therapist's expression shifted, became almost sympathetic. You took a wrong turn in the fog, found a place that shouldn't exist, a town outside normal geography. You weren't supposed to be able to leave it, but you tried anyway. Ran into the forest, crossed through thin spaces, ended up somewhere else that shouldn't exist. Now you're caught between, not fully in one reality or another. How do I get back? You don't. The trail has cracks, places where the world doesn't connect properly. You fell through. This is where people like you end up. We keep you comfortable, keep you from disrupting the boundaries further. It's not cruel, it's necessary. Finley wanted to argue, wanted to insist she deserved freedom, deserved her real life back. But looking around the therapy room at the other patients, seeing their faces, she recognized the truth. They were all ghosts, all of them caught in the same liminal space, existing but not fully real anymore. Years pass differently in the facility. Finley has stopped tracking time in any meaningful way. She participates in activities, paints landscapes, walks the grounds. Occasionally, she sees new patients arrive, though they're not really new, just others who found the cracks in reality and fell through. Sometimes she thinks about the photograph, the one from 1955 showing the staff who never age. Wonders how long they've been maintaining this place. How many people have been quarantined here across how many decades? How many hikers took wrong turns and found spaces that broke their ability to exist in normal reality? Her room has a window. Sometimes she looks out and sees mountains. Sometimes she sees her hospital room in normal psychiatric facility. Sometimes she sees the town from the fog, still existing somewhere. All three realities layered over each other. Finley knows she'll never leave, knows this is permanent. The best she can hope for is adjustment, accepting that she exists in multiple states simultaneously, present but absent, real but impossible, a ghost walking the grounds of an institution that might not exist, treating a condition that's actually just being aware of things humans aren't supposed to notice. The Appalachian Trail continues without her. Thousands of people hike it every year. Most make it through safely, but some take wrong turns, find thin spaces, see things that break their ability to reconcile reality. And when that happens, they end up here, in the place between places, being told they're delusional while knowing they've simply seen too much, Have you ever felt like reality was different than what everyone told you it was? What would you do if you could never prove which version was true? Thank you for watching Bleak Fears. These stories from the Appalachian Trail remind us that wilderness holds mysteries we may never fully understand. Some paths lead to places we can't return from. If you enjoyed these accounts, subscribe for more true horror stories. Share your own unexplained experiences in the comments. Stay safe out there, and remember, not all trails lead home.